Hello and welcome to the Zero Show. I'm Daniel, and this isn't Chris, this is Alex.
Hello.
Alex has been playing Arkham Knight. Chris will be here later on. He's been hanging out with Dave Gibbons. Dave Gibbons.
I know.
Went around to his gaff.
But I've been hanging out with Batman, which is surely cool.
Which is, well, it's comparable. So you've played Arkham Knight for how many hours?
Only about half an hour.
But more than most people in the world.
So Rocksteady's being super protective over the main game itself. So not really kind of talking much about the story or kind of where Batman's going to go through the kind of game itself.
All we know really is this. Again, it takes place across one night.
Yep.
It's got this mysterious Arkham Knight figure, and that's really it so far. Yep. So the stuff you played didn't delve into the story anymore.
No, it was a bunch of side missions, but obviously it's set within Gotham, and it gave me a pretty good idea of what the final game is going to be like. Story aside. So I'm going to give you 6 reasons why I think Arkham Knight is going to be a badass game.
Okay.
Number 1.
Okay.
We've seen it in the trailers, but dual play. And this is kind of, not obviously you play as Batman throughout most of the game, but in some of the fights, you can switch characters to play as Nightwing or Robin or, some of the other kind of people.
How do you do it? Like, is it quite an easy thing to do? Like, you do it by accident?
No. It's like it's simply a bumper press on the pad. Because what happens is you'll kind of go into an area, and I was fighting some of the Penguin's henchmen, and then Nightwing turned up, and he basically says, right, let's get this done together. You press the R1, I think it was, and you switch controls. But the more kind of combos you build up, then you can do kind of dual takedowns as you're switching between characters.
And can you do this at any point in the game, or is it limited to certain situations?
Specific fights, yes. They didn't. I spoke to Rocksteady about it, and they were quite cagey as to kind of how and where it would be used. But from what I can gather, you will kind of crash into a fight against 20 men or whatever. And
so when the odds are against you, you need backup. Okay.
But what's quite nice,
it's not like a Lego game where any time you can just switch between characters.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. But what is nice about it is that, Nightwing sort of like stood around, and the kind of storyline was carried on from there, and he was like, well, what are we going to do about Scarecrow, all this kind of stuff. So it's not just he turns up and then disappears. There's quite good interaction between Batman and Nightwing, and I haven't seen it, but Robin presumably further down the line.
So next up is the big thing they're selling the game on really for a long time is the Batmobile.
Yeah. Now, what I really like about the Batmobile is it's the Batmobile, and it's a new way of kind of getting around Gotham, but it really has changed the entire structure of the game, and that obviously includes Gotham, because if you look at what Gotham was like in Arkham City, it was kind of very densely packed. The roads were very narrow, and basically they've had to kind of start from the ground up and rebuild it so you can get this car that obviously steams along really, really quickly through the streets. So it's much, much wider, more open, and it's just a lot of fun.
I think this thing in Arkham City, like they kind of pitched it as an open world game, and it was a couple of neighbourhoods. I never spent any time on street level really, unless when I had to go down to the courthouse at the beginning to take on Harvey Dent, and I can't really remember the streets much, but obviously with the car, with Batmobile, you're on ground level quite a lot more if you want to be.
Well, I think
so. Is
you are
more
right.
Interesting from that angle.
You can go across the whole of Gotham by gliding and using the grappling hook. That's still very much the case. But there is a lot to be said, and there's a lot of fun being in the Batmobile. And
so, what can it do? Like, how does it handle? Because it handles like a car, but also you can manipulate in other ways.
So it's got 2 modes. Obviously, pursuit mode is kind of when it's driving quickly, and you've got the afterburner. And much like Batman himself, you can upgrade it, so you can improve the weapons on it. You can improve the afterburner because it's pretty short burst when you first get it. But then the other kind of mode is the battle mode. So the one thing, the criticism I had of the game is that you use, much like any other racing game, R2 to accelerate, but L2 switches to battle mode and isn't brake. Brake is square, which is really confusing when you start playing it, because you're going along really quick, you see a corner coming up, and your instinct is to hit L2, but you turn into tank mode, and it's like, ah!
That's what I do when I take corners. I turn into a tank.
Yeah. And I think you'll get used to it.
Yeah.
But, this is based on a very small playthrough. But in tank mode, that's you take on loads of these kind of like robotic tanks, and it almost turns into a bit of a kind of
mech
game. At times. I hope there's not too much of that, because
that doesn't really say Batman to me at all.
No. But the way that Batman interacts with the Batmobile is a lot of fun. If they keep those the kind of battles against the other kind of drone tanks to a minimum, I think it will be enjoyable.
So next up, we're going to talk about something, because obviously the Riddler's always been a presence in the Arkham game. He's not an out-and-out villain, he's an antagonist, but he's more challenged Batman cerebrally, which he often does, obviously, in the source material. And he kind of challenges Batman, but also brings in the Batmobile.
Yeah, so kind of new for this game are the Riddler races, which, when I first heard about them, I was like, it's a bit kind of weird. Like, Riddler's got this massive underground network of these kind of tunnels that go everywhere, and it is a side part to the game itself. But what I thought was really good about them, and I didn't kind of fully understand until I played it, is that it's not literally race around a fixed circuit. You've got to use your kind of radio jammer to change the way that the track unfolds. So you'll be going along and there's a massive hole, but you use a radio jammer and then it will cause like a ledge to come across. And on the circuit that I did, I had to go around 3 times, and every time it got faster and faster and faster, so you had to kind of switch between the different parts of the track. Like, there was a jump where you kind of went up and a wall, but you had to have the kind of, obviously the jump there to kind of do it, but if you didn't press it in time, then you'd hit the wall. So it's kind of a nice addition, but obviously it's in addition to the game itself. It's not, completely integral.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about like new stuff.
Yes.
But like going back to something that's core to the series, core to its success, and fighting.
Well, the one thing that I loved and I've always loved about the Arkham games is Batman is the ultimate badass, even from the very beginning, and it will have a skill tree much like all the previous games. But even right from the very start, you're super tough. But it's just no other game does hand-to-hand combat as well as Batman.
So I remember when the first demo for Asylum dropped on Xbox Live. I knew nothing about the game. I didn't work in games back then. And it's like the new Batman game. And just because of licensed games in general, pretty skeptical. I think you're right to be pretty skeptical. It's like, download the demo. And I think everyone on the same thing was like, this is really good. This is so good. And I think the fighting is core to that. It's like, it's relatively a simple system. Like but it's the fluidity counter system is really simple, but it's amazing how many games have adopted that. And definitely within Warner Brothers stable of games, like I feel it looks like Mad Max is adopting it. Mordor did to an extent, and it's just a really simple, elegant system.
But so it has evolved slightly. The enemies that you've got are smarter. There's more variety. Obviously, previously you've had guys with guns, guys with kind of, lead pipes, that kind of stuff. That's all in there still. But you kind of get grabbed from behind and you have to kind of shake them off. You've still got to use your cape to stun kind of some of the tougher guys. But like, again, just the options that are open to you, using your the grappling hook to bring people closer, punch them in the face, and then throw them at other people. So it's one of those systems that you can pick up and play, and it's very, very simple, and you don't have to master the controls or the combos, but when you do, it's incredibly rewarding. And like I say, Mad Max has done it since, or will do it, a very similar system, but it just works really, really well in Batman, and hats off to Rocksteady.
So 5, did you get to see any recurring villains, new villains?
So Firefly was back in the demo, and it was a really kind of cool chase through the Gotham streets where he's kind of torching the tarmac, and you've got to avoid that and chase him in the Batmobile. Penguin was also in there briefly, but the new trailer that came out this week as well has got Poison Ivy in it, and she looks really, really cool.
It's like weird because there's that tendency, I think, in all the Arkham games, and especially there's some comics where it's just like, put them all in. Rather than, I almost would like a story with a singular villain, like throughout the entire game. Like it seems like that's going to be. Well, originally I thought it was Arkham Knight, because that's like the mystery of the game. But then for a time it seems like Scarecrow's the one pulling the strings.
Well, so I spoke to Rocksteady. The explanation is Scarecrow's definitely the guy at the top. How Arkham Knight fits into it, don't really know right now.
I think that's the mystery, and that's why we don't know anything about the story, because I think to reveal anything about the story probably gives that away. Maybe it's like, I'd be interested if the Arkham Knight thing wasn't like a final 10-minute reveal. It was maybe a midpoint reveal or something like that really turns it on its head. Obviously there's lots of Batman comics that kind of play with that, Hush in particular, revealing someone's identity to kick on. So I wonder if Arkham Knight's going to kind of tap into what Hush did a little bit. But finally, the big man.
So, who doesn't want to play as Batman? And, he's kind of bigger, badder than he's ever been before. He's got more gadgets. The Disrupt gun is a whole lot of fun, and you can do kind of loads of different things with it. Obviously, Batarangs are kind of more improved and evolved than they have been previously. But I think the thing that really kind of shone for me in just the half-hour demo that I saw was he's just got some cool one-liners, and you just, when you're playing as him, you're just like,
Conroy as well.
Yeah. And it just works really, really well. You know, the way he interacts with the villains, the way that he interacts with Gordon. It's just, you know, the writing, certainly from the bit that I saw, is really, really good still. And that was kind of the thing that didn't work quite so well in Origins for me. So I'm pleased it's back at Rocksteady. Who knows what the main story is going to be like? Yeah. I hope it's as good as, you know, the previous 2 Rocksteady games.
What do you think of the look of Batman? Like, I really like Arkham's world is really unified and it works, and it feels like he's got more high tech over time. Like the Arkham Knight Batman is super high tech and he's got all these monitors and stuff. Like, do you like that? It's like a different aesthetic. Like, I'm quite a traditionalist when it comes to Batman.
Really?
Yeah.
It's definitely. I thought there was quite a lot in common with the stuff that we've seen in Batman and Superman, where he's, you know, the kind of like mecha Batman almost. But it feels like they've had to layer on more and more stuff, and I guess that's, you know, that's how video games are made. Yeah. It's a kind of adding functionality and features.
Otherwise, he's going to repeat core mechanics. Yeah. Do you reckon we'll get Superman or someone else might pop up?
Well, the one thing
that'd
that
be cool.
I wondered,
my money's on Superman appearing at some point.
Because I wondered whether we would see something of Joker. Obviously, I'm not going to go into spoilers in terms of what happened at City, but will he come back? I don't know.
Just because, like, Warner obviously is in that position where, you know, it owns DC, it makes movies, it makes games of its properties. Things can kind of, obviously it's very difficult to coordinate a huge corporation.
Yes.
There's some communication probably going, we've got this plan to launch all these characters, can you maybe seed it? We know these games are really popular. Obviously, if it all takes off, like, if Rocksteady did, like, we know nothing, but just say hypothetically they did a Justice League game.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
And maybe, you know, this feels like the end of their trilogy. This, you know, Origins is their own thing. Yeah. This is the end of their trilogy. Yeah. Be interested to see what they do next.
It'd be awesome if they set it up.
Yeah, and it'd be like, I can't imagine Warner wanting them not to be the people to do it.
Yeah.
Like, because they have such pedigree doing this well.
Yeah.
They know that will buy a lot of kind of goodwill from people, because people have been burnt with bad Superman games in the past. And, but maybe.
I would love to see
Superman game.
Well, Rocksteady's take on Superman would be amazing to see.
Awesome. Yeah. So, what do you want from Arkham Knight? Are you excited for us? Let us know at superheroShow@ign.com. And until next week, I'll leave you with Chris.
I'm not with my usual comic cohort, Mr. Krupa, but I'm rather with comic legend Dave Gibbons, the man who's worked for 2000 AD, DC, Marvel, the man behind Watchmen, and of course Secret Service, which has been turned into Kingsman, which is out on digital HD already and coming out on Blu-ray and DVD June 8th.
Fantastic.
I'll get your plug in to begin with.
Great.
So first question, this is a collaboration with Mark Millar. And I believe, didn't you receive a letter from him? I mean, how did you first come into contact with Mark Millar?
Mark has always been great at self-promotion, and that's one of the things I love about him. He does not hide his light under a bushel, and I think that's a good thing. Too many people do. I have no recollection of it, but apparently when he was 17 or something, he wrote me a letter. He was just leaving school, I think, and I just finished doing Watchmen. And it was a letter telling me what my next career step should be. And that was, of course, to collaborate with Mark, because he had the perfect story for me. And that should be the next thing I did. And I thought it was very nice. I have no memory of the letter. I'm sure it was very well written, very persuasive. And all that does survive is that I sent him quite a gracious letter back saying, thank you for your interest. I do appreciate the compliment. But, you know, unfortunately, I have the next thing planned out anyway. But all the best with your career. And here's a sketch. And I forgot all about it, but Mark remembered it. And indeed, I think in one of the Kingsman editions, he actually reproduces my letter back to him. So that was the first I knew of Mark. And then his name started to pop up in... He did some stuff for 2000 AD when he was partnered with Grant Morrison. And then the first thing that I really remember reading of his and thinking, wow, that's really good, was he wrote some stuff for, I think it was called Adventures of Superman, which was the kind of juvenile end of the Superman line. Very simple stories, very kind of almost vanilla Superman stories, the sort of thing I read when I was growing up. And I thought he wrote some really engaging stories, you know, within the confines of that. And then he moved on to other things, and obviously his name popped up all over the place, to the point that, just as he'd been a fan of mine, waiting for Watchmen to come out, I would find myself phoning my local comic book store and saying, is the latest issue of the Ultimates out? Is it worth coming in? Because I want to see what happens next. So I ended up being a kind of rabid fan of Mark's. And I did actually miss... To answer your question in full, the question I think you're about to ask, I did actually miss a chance to work with Mark before. I was offered the art on Red Sun, which was an Elseworlds story that Mark wrote. You know, Superman comes to Earth in Soviet Russia rather than in Kansas. And it sounded like a great idea, but it really was just because I was too busy at that particular time. But that's one of the might-have-beens that I really regret not being able to do.
And so why was Secret Service the right project for you guys to collaborate on?
Well, I think what it really was that we both reached a point where we were able to collaborate, where we both had the time and we had enough, regard for each other's work. And personally, we had a good rapport that it seemed like a fun thing to do. And that's really what I've based all my kind of collaborations on. Would I like to work with this guy, not only on the professional level, but on the personal level as well? And Mark, as you know, he's a very affable, very friendly, great company, great guy to talk to. And he pitched this idea of a spy story. It was originally going to be called Uncle Sam and set in the US. And that was sort of quite good. And I did some roughs of the spy and the kid stood in front of the seal of office, the president's seal of office, and a stars and stripes. And it was sort of all right. But it was when we decided to make it set in Britain rather than the States that we could actually delve into a lot of kind of Ken Loach, English reality stuff, that it really took fire for me. And I'd never done a spy book before. I mean, I'd done shed loads of superhero stuff and science fiction stuff, and it just felt right to do a spy story. But as I say, with that added element of sort of social realism in it.
And what's it like putting together a comic book when you know the movie's already happening? Because it was, they were kind of side by side at one point, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, it was a completely different beast than, say, the Watchmen adaptation, where the way I sort of look upon it is Watchmen was the father and the movie was the very faithful son carrying on the family tradition. With the Secret Service comic book, as it was then called, and the Kingsman movie, they were more like brothers who sort of shared a lot of the same DNA but evolved differently. I mean, they were more or less the same, and they resembled each other in the way that brothers do. But actually at an early stage, Mark called a halt because he didn't think that Matthew was going to make a movie at that point. He thought, I believe, that we were going to do the comic, and then at some later date there would be a movie. But Matthew wanted to get on that next. So it was a really weird thing. We were off doing the comic while Matthew was off developing the movie, and the screenplay was being written by Jane Goldman. And it wasn't until after I'd finished the comic that I ever read the screenplay or saw what was going on. And it was really strange. It was like the whole thing seen in a funhouse mirror. But of course, for that reason, I really enjoyed the movie because I literally didn't quite know what was going to happen next, And
it did pretty well.
Financially, it did. I mean, it was a really interesting thing to say, and I to see. And I knew that I'd arrived in the movie business where, after we'd been to New York for the New York premiere of Kingsman, my wife and I went down to Florida to see some friends down there, and I found myself on my sun lounger by the pool checking my cumes, the cumulative total box office takings. And it was really interesting to track that because we came out the same week as 50 Shades of Grey, which started up here. And we started, in a good position, but not up there. And as even a couple of weeks went by, 50 Shades of Grey went whoomph. Yeah. But Kingsman kind of kept level.
That word of mouth.
Yeah, and it was absolutely word of mouth. And of course, it's most rewarding when people who outside the little world of comics, or comparatively little world of comics and movies, like civilians, as I like to call them, friends who go to the movies but don't know much about them, phone me up or send me an email saying, I've just seen the movie, it's great. And of course I take all the credit for it. So yeah, it was wonderful to see a movie which again was just purely an entertaining movie. Well, yeah, it was purely an entertaining movie. And it was the kind of movie I think that you used to get a lot of, where you could go on a Saturday night and cheer for the good guys and hiss at the bad guys, and see a lot of action, have a lot of humour. And you know, it just felt to me like a really good night out of the movies.
And big in Korea, I think. South Korea, isn't it?
Massive.
Yeah, Mark keeps telling me this. I'm big in South Korea.
The most successful non-domestic movie ever, I think,
really?
is in South Korea.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Who knew?
And I know there's been talk of a sequel to the movie, but what about you and Mark? Any plans to do a sequel to the comic?
I don't think at the moment we have got any plans to do that. I mean, Mark, as you know, is writing so many things at the moment, and I'm off doing lots of projects of my own. And I think if we did do a sequel, it wouldn't necessarily be anything like the movie sequel. I think our requirements for a sequel would be somehow different.
Yeah.
But no, we've not talked in any concrete terms about doing that, but you never know.
Yeah, sure. So can I take you back to the beginning, please, Dave? When did you know you wanted to be an artist?
God, I think probably I must have been 4 or 5. I just always loved to draw. My dad worked in town planning, so there would always, I've memories of him drawing plans at the dining room table. So there were always professional drawing tools. There was always bottles of ink and brushes and watercolour and pens and everything like that. And when to apply for planning permission, you have to send like 5 or 6 copies of the plan, most of which are thrown away afterwards. So my dad would always from work bring me back discarded plans that had been cut up into drawing pads. So I always had plenty of materials to draw with. And I've always loved, I mean, I'm quite gregarious and a bit of a chatterbox, as you know, but I've always liked the idea of sitting in my own little corner and making something. So I used to love to draw. I used to love construction toys like, it was long before Lego, Meccano and mini bricks and stuff like that. And I think when I discovered comics, I don't know whether it was because of an attention-seeking thing, that if you just drew a single drawing, you could go, look what I did, and they go, oh yeah, great. Whereas with the comic, it's, oh yeah, and this happens and that happens and this, and then this happens and this happens. I don't know whether it's because of that, but I fell in love with the idea of actually telling stories in pictures. And I started to see American comics and collect American comics in particular, because they were self-contained, they were in colour, they just seemed exotic, I think, as well. You know, artifacts of an alien civilization with all these things. I mean, forget the characters, things like Schwinn bikes and Tootsie Rolls and Daisy BB guns. It was like a doorway to a whole exciting, colourful dimension. And so I used to draw my own superheroes. I'd often swipe them from, I'd swipe the stories from the comics and change Superman into Atom Man and Batman into Birdman. And then I love Mad comic as well. And so I do Mad type spoofs of British TV programmes. And I just always, it was always comics. It wasn't just drawing, it was actually telling a story was what captivated me.
And so you became a surveyor.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a memory of my dad taking me to see the local artist to see if I was a good enough artist to make a living. Because the only artists they knew was sort of down and out, or, you know. Anyway, they took me to see the local artist, and I took the thing that I was working on, which was actually a line-for-line copy of an issue of World's Finest starring Superman and Batman, where I'd literally, you know, and that was actually how I learned to draw, was by copying. But now I realise that this artist must have looked at it and thought, I don't remember hearing these words, but, yeah, he's keen, but it's not original. You can immediately tell when something's traced or copied. And, you know, if that was the advice my parents got, I think they were very right to say, well, maybe you could do something else and come back to drawing when you've got something to fall back on. So I thought I might be a surveyor, but that was an 8-year course with a 10% success rate, or the other way around. And I knew I didn't have the fire in my belly. So I became a building surveyor, which was the next best thing. You know, it was drawing and it was kind of creating buildings. And the other really good thing about it was that I got to spend a lot of time out of the office, which meant I'd sign myself out to go and look at some wall falling down in the Old Kent Road in London where I worked. But then I'd spend 20 minutes looking at that, and then I'd spend the next 2 hours going in all the secondhand bookshops and filling in my collection of American comics. And I also happened to work just round the corner from IPC magazines, who are the biggest publishers of comics in Britain. And I'd hang around there in the lunch hour as well. I'd take long lunch hours and do balloon lettering and get to know everybody, and, you know, and that was how I sort of got into the business. So it was actually, as it happened, a really good route to take. And as I was showing you earlier, I recently came across my Chartered Surveyor diploma, which I never ever took out of the cardboard tube I got it in, but I've now got it proudly framed on the wall.
Yeah, it's quite a funny artefact, isn't it, to have it on the wall here?
And I do still pay my annual subscription, and I still get the magazine. Not that I want to fall back on it, but it just, you know, it just seems right.
Is there a 2000 AD character or comic that you think should have got a movie by now?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was really glad when they finally made a good Dredd movie. I mean, that was great to see Dredd literally come alive in a way that was exactly the character you'd always loved in the comic. I co-created a character called Rogue Trooper, who's basically this blue-skinned genetic infantryman who's trapped on this world of death that he really doesn't want to be on. And I had high hopes for that. And from time to time, there have been sniffs about it, you know. And there was a Rogue Trooper game which looked pretty good. I'm not a huge games player. Don't know how well it played. So that's something I think could still make a really good movie. I actually got to write a short Rogue Trooper series called War Machine that actually had the length and the form of a movie. And even when I was writing, I thought, this would make a good movie. This hits all the beats, and this is a great launch pad for the characters. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's almost frustrating because Dredd was so good, the Alex Garland version, but it didn't quite have the success to kind of lead to sequels. And now I thought it was going to lead to a bunch of 2000 AD characters, and Rogue Trooper does seem like the obvious one.
Yes, so. Yeah. Well, I think the problem with Dredd really was that they released it only in 3D, or largely in 3D. And I think they lost a lot of the audience because of that. I saw it in 3D, but I much more enjoyed it in 2D. Perhaps this is heresy, but I don't think 3D is always the best treatment. And I mean, it actually worked quite well. Of 3D movies, Dredd worked quite well in 3D. But I think that actually, in a way, hobbled it. I don't think it had the release that it could have done.
Yeah. Now, you after 2000 AD or around that time, you did some DC stuff as well. You moved on to Green Lantern. So what was the differences between working for a UK company and a big US monster like that?
Well, in the day-to-day work, I mean, it's the same gig, really. I mean, you're drawing different characters and you're drawing a different page size and stuff like that. But it was interesting, actually, because, you know, my ambition had always been to work for American comics. And I'd gone over there in the 70s with my samples and thanks, but no thanks. But then, unbelievably, when I did join DC, which was like in 81 or something, they actually came over here and recruited artists and writers. They invited us to their hotel suite and said, OK, we want you to work for us. We've seen what you've done in 2000 AD and Warrior. And we want you to work for us, and we'll pay you this much, which was more than we were getting paid. We'll give you the artwork back afterwards, which we'd had a huge struggle to get. We'll even give you the pre-ruled board to draw it on. And we'll give you reprint money, and we'll give you royalties. I mean, it literally was the offer you couldn't refuse. But actually, it got off to a little bit of a rocky start, because what they wanted me to do, I later discovered, was they just bought the comic book rights for Star Trek. And they wanted me to draw Star Trek, because I'd shown I could do science fiction, outer space stuff. And from what I'd done on Doctor Who, I showed them I could draw likenesses. But it would have been a nightmare. I really would not have wanted to do it, because, you know, imagine scene 1, Bridge of the Enterprise. Okay, so in that one picture, you've got to draw 6 likenesses, you know.
Yeah.
But I did look at the work of an Italian artist called Alberto Giolitti, who had it down to a fine art. He drew a Star Trek for Gold Key, who previously owned it. And on any given page, he would have one long shot of the Enterprise flying through space with word balloons. He'd have one shot from behind Captain Kirk looking at a screen. He'd have one silhouette shot. He might have one mid-length shot with a few likenesses, and then he'd have one really good likeness of one of the characters. So there is a smart way to do it, but I really didn't want to draw likenesses. It was the sort of superhero stuff, and so it originally gave me backups to do the Creeper, who was a character I quite liked, and the Green Lantern Corps, which I always liked that sort of science fiction end of the DC universe.
Yeah, because hadn't you done Dan Dare as well? Isn't that?
Yeah, I'd done Dan Dare. I tried to do Dan Dare right. I don't think Dan Dare was ever done right. Funnily enough, on my drawing board or on my drawing tablet at the moment is a cover that I'm doing for a collection of all the Dan Dare stuff I did, which is really for old time's sake. But I've tried valiantly to make Dan Dare a success. But I think maybe the idea of bringing him back was flawed.
Yeah.
But anyway, I did give it a try. No, so once I'd established myself doing Green Lantern Corps backups, they then offered me the lead story. And
so John Stewart was yours, wasn't he?
Yeah, I did get to draw Hal Jordan, but unfortunately, a lot of the stuff I got to draw wasn't the space-spanning Green Lantern Corps stuff. It was kind of soap opera stuff. I mean, Len Wein wrote it just fine, but it was the soap opera stuff of him standing in the parking lot of Ferris aircraft, having lovelorn arguments with Carol Ferris. And then they tried to change the game a bit and brought John Stewart in, who I really liked as a character, and I got to reintroduce him. But really towards the end of my interest in Green Lantern, which came after about a year or so, Watchmen was being set up, so it actually made a very convenient kind of segue for me.
Now, Watchmen was something you really went after, wasn't it? From what I've read, or did it come to you? How did that?
Well, I was still working on Green Lantern when I got a call from Len Wein, who was one of the creators of Swamp Thing, asking me if I had the phone number of a British writer called Alan Moore, because they thought he might be able to do something with Swamp Thing. So I gave them Alan's number because I knew Alan quite well by then, and Len phoned him up, and I think Alan put the phone down. He thought it was some friends having a prank. But actually, before that, Alan and I tried to get a few things going at DC, because I'd been working for DC for a year or two, and Alan was still doing stuff for 2000 AD and Warrior. And we tried to get a Challenges of the Unknown series going. We talked a lot about that, and Alan wrote a synopsis. I mentioned it to contacts of mine at DC, and they said, no, sorry, we've already promised Challenges to someone else. So I didn't even get as far as drawing artwork for that. We then tried to do a treatment of John John's Manhunter from Mars, and I even drew some sketches, but we got the same... No, sorry, we promised John Johns to someone else. And they were wonderful stories that Alan wrote. The Challenges thing was like everybody in the DC universe, like a kind of multiple crisis thing. Wow. And the John Johns thing was a wonderful thing, mixing 1950s small town communist paranoia with there actually being someone from another planet there, whose secret identity was the policeman who was supposed to be investigating these reports of this alien from another planet. It would have been brilliant, but we didn't ever get to do it. So when I heard that Alan was doing a treatment of the Charlton characters originally published by Charlton Comics, who DC had bought, I thought, wow, this could be the thing. Phoned Alan up, and he said, oh yeah, you'd be great for it. And he sent me the outline, which was just brilliant. And a couple of weeks later, I was going to the Chicago Comic-Con, and I had a great evening there. I went up to Dick Giordano, who was the managing editor, and said, oh, this thing that Alan's doing with the Charlton characters, I'd like to draw it. He said, how does Alan feel about that? I said, yeah, he'd like me to do it. He said, okay, it's yours. And then I reeled away from that and bumped into Julie Schwartz, who edited all my favourite comics as a kid, who said, Dave, when are you going to draw some Superman for us? I went, anytime you like, Julie, who's going to write it? He said, who do you want to write it? I said, Alan Moore. He said, okay, fix it up. So that was the story called For the Man Who Has Everything, which was a real boyhood dream come true. The best character, the best editor, and the best writer. To get to draw that was a real high spot. And that all happened, that and Watchmen, in the space of 5 minutes at a convention. So
wow. What's it like collaborating with Alan?
Great. I mean, he's a wonderful collaborator. I mean, I don't have to tell anybody who's watching this what a genius he is. And I use the word genius sparingly.
Yeah.
I think he is one of the few genuine geniuses in comics. So the work he does is just of an amazing quality. He's one of the most professional people I've ever worked for. He never left me hanging for a script, even if he had to stay up all night and put it in a taxi to get to me the next day. And we would always talk things over before he started work. So I felt very involved in the process. And just a great guy to work with.
It was like an atomic bomb hitting the industry, though. Were you surprised at the impact it had?
Watchmen?
Yeah.
What Alan and I wanted to do was, we had no plans to change the industry or write the Moby Dick of comics or anything. I mean, you couldn't start off like that. We were just both excited about the story and really just wanted to do the kind of comic that we would have liked to read. And we were largely left alone by DC. I mean, once we'd created our own characters, they really had nothing to lose. There wasn't anything of DC's that we were going to damage. And Alan and I lived about 50 miles away from each other. I recruited John Higgins, who'd been a friend of mine for a long time, to do the colouring. So basically, Alan and I would talk about the story, Alan would write the story, I would draw it, John would colour it, we'd send them the art. And they would proofread it, and, they did catch some errors, but largely it was just us having fun. And I think that shows. I think the lack of editorial interference, of micromanagement, of continuity, trying to tie it into continuity, I think really, really shows. And I think all the best comics, all the best creative works anyway, happen when people are enjoying themselves doing it.
It feels like a really original vision that's just been allowed to go from beginning to end without that interference that I'm sure ruined so many.
Yeah, and I mean, we would talk a lot on the phone, Alan and I, and most of the conversation would have nothing to do with Watchmen. It would be about childhood memories or feelings we got from certain works of fiction or things that we glimpsed in comics that we wanted to explore a bit further. So it really was not just drilling down through the characters, but drilling down through our own psyches and coming up with the stuff that we found fascinating about comics.
And right from the off, it felt like Hollywood wanted to make a movie of it, but really struggled. I mean, Terry Gilliam, Darren Aronofsky, Paul Greengrass. And who came the closest of them to getting that made? And what do you think the difficulties were with all those different kind of iterations?
Well, I think the person who put it best, Alan said Watchmen is unfilmable, and, that's arguably true. Larry Gordon, who eventually was one of the producers of the movie, said Watchmen was unfinanceable. And it was because nobody had ever heard of any of the characters. It was obviously going to be a long, long movie. It was going to have to deal with adult themes. Because it was not just the characters that were the popular thing about it, it was the way we told the story. It would have to at least adhere to some of the rather unconventional storytelling devices, in movie terms, unconventional storytelling devices. So it was a really hard sell. Now, we met Joel Silver very early on, who's the action movie director, did the Die Hard movies and Matrix and things like that. He wanted to have Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. He saw it as an action movie. A script was commissioned by Sam Hamm, who wrote the very early Batman movies. It was more or less the Watchmen as the Avengers. It was that kind of feel. I know that Terry Gilliam was in the frame at one time. I think he got as far as having a conversation with Alan in which they decided it was unfilmable. Darren Aronofsky didn't come very, very close to doing anything. Paul Greengrass went as far as having production artwork done.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, I met a guy called David Hayter, who is kind of general madman about comics, and I saw the screenplay that he'd written, and I thought it was an amazing job of boiling everything down. He completely understood it and actually made it work as a movie. And then I heard that Zack Snyder was going to be involved, and we went to the premiere of 300, which was the movie that Zack made based on Frank Miller's graphic novel. And I wanted just to say hello to Zack. So I grabbed him as he was going behind the VIP ropes at the premiere and said, "Oh, hi, Zack, I'm Dave Gibbons. I hear you're going to be making the movie Watchmen. I wanted to say saying, oh, great. So rather than just a quick hello, we then stood there having a conversation for half an hour or more while his people were looking at their watches and saying. So I knew from that conversation that he absolutely got it, and I had huge faith in him. And, the whole thing kind of went from there. By that time, Alan had a very bad taste left in his mouth by Hollywood because of what happened with League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and V for Vendetta as well. So he was off movies by then. But I thought, well, if they're going to make a movie, this is the guy I think can make it right. And until I find it that I really don't like it, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And if they want me to be a bit involved with it, I will. And I ended up being quite involved with it. And that in itself didn't cause any friction between me and Alan. And I had a really good experience of the Watchmen movie. And I think they did make the best movie you probably could have made from it. I know everybody could do a different edit, or lots of people didn't like the ending. Zach knew about the ending. He wasn't like blundering in thinking, we'll throw out the squid, we'll just make it this. He knew exactly what he was doing. And I think in movie making terms, it was a better solution than we had in the comic.
Yeah.
So, it was finally producible, it was finally financeable. But I think it was because of all the other superhero movies that had come out by then that the general movie going public got comics in the way that the people who read the comic book got comics. And so they thought, okay, I get it. Night Owl, he's like Batman, he's got a subterranean cave, he's got an owl ship, got it. So we could get on and tell the story by that time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people found the comic, the graphic novel through the film, a lot of younger people as well. So
Well, I would have to say that whether you like the movie or not, whether you feel it was a desecration of Holy Writ or whatever, certainly we sold more than 1 million copies of the graphic novel on the back of the movies. When the trailer came out for Watchmen, we sold as many copies of Watchmen in the next 3 months as we'd sold in the entire previous life of the graphic novel. So a lot of people read Alan's words and saw my drawings who would never otherwise have seen it. And I would hope that maybe brought a lot of people into comics who then sought out other things that they'd heard of and realised that there was something in comics that you could still enjoy when you were grown up.
See, Alan should be thanking Hollywood. It's just a glorified trailer for his book.
Well, it's not for me to say what Alan should or shouldn't be doing. But, I mean, to my mind, that was, on any level, that was, a great plus of the whole thing.
Yeah. Now, you've done stuff for Marvel and DC. What's the difference between working for those two companies?
Well, I haven't really done very much stuff for Marvel. It's strange. I never quite figured out how it works up there. I mean, I've got loads of friends up there. I've known Joe Quesada for a long, long time. Joe credits Watchmen with the very thing that brought him into comics. But I've only done odd little things.
Right.
I wrote a Captain America series. I drew a Doctor Strange issue. I did a Hulk story. It's very erratic. They reprinted all my Doctor Who stuff that I did new covers for, and they've always treated me very well. But I'm not part of the gang there. I don't feel not for any bad feeling on anybody's part. It's just that I've always been a DC guy, and I must admit, growing up, DC, well, they were always my favourite comics. They just felt a bit sharper to me. They felt a bit. They appealed to my aesthetic sense more than Marvel, although I collected all the Marvel comics from the first issue. And I don't know, I think their characters resonate with me, the child inside me, more than the Marvel characters do. But having said that, I absolutely love what they've done with the Marvel movies. And I think they've exactly captured the spirit of the Marvel characters in a way that, unfortunately, I think maybe the DC movies so far, particularly, of course, Green Lantern, haven't quite done.
Yeah.
But I've got high hopes for what Zach might be able to do with Batman and Superman in a movie together. So,
is he the right guy? Because it's looking in part like sort of a semi adaptation of Dark Knight Returns, which is the other great sort of comic of the 80s, graphic novel of the 80s. So, do you think he's the right guy?
Well, I think Zach is a fantastic movie maker, and I think his vision is so strong and so focused and so sometimes idiosyncratic that I always find his movies really interesting because I don't quite know what I'm going to see. Indeed, if I had any misgivings, and I really do hope for everybody concerned that it does really good business, but I think Batman and Superman would have been enough. I think Marvel have been very shrewd about introducing their characters one at a time. Yeah. So then when they do join up, it's, oh, wow. Just like the thrill I got when I first saw Marvel's Avengers comic. Really? All these characters all in one comic? Or when I first saw the Justice League? I think if it was me, I'd have done Superman, Batman, one of their really strong characters, maybe a reboot of Green Lantern. A lot of their other characters are quite well known on the TV. And then a little bit down the line, done the blockbuster where they all get together,
because it feels like it's going to need to be a 12-hour movie to let everyone have a bit of space.
So I'm not in any way involved with it, and I'm as distant from it, probably more distant from it than you are.
So do you have a favourite superhero?
Well, I suppose it would have to be Superman, if you could only have one superhero, who would it be? Superman is the daddy of them all. He's the one that all the others are descended from in some degree. And he's the first superhero character I loved as a kid. And as I say, one of my most treasured experiences in comics was to get to draw Superman with Alan and with Julie Schwartz. So I think it would have to be Superman. I still think he's the one that resonates the most. I still think he's the most interesting. He's the most primal in many ways. So yeah, it would have to be Superman.
Is there a character or team that you haven't got to draw yet that you'd still like to? Or have you done it all?
Woo. No, I haven't done it all by any means. I've been really, really lucky that I've got to work with great contemporaries of mine like Alan, like Frank Miller, like Garth Ennis, like Mark, near contemporaries. But I've also been lucky that I've worked with Stan Lee. I've worked with Will Eisner, who created the Spirit. I got to ink one Jack Kirby drawing.
Wow.
And I've done Superman, and I've done Batman, and I've done Captain America. So many of my kind of fanboy shopping list items carry a big tick. And I think really, not to say I've done it all, because I don't think I have, and I don't think with the richness of the fictional universes that there are around DC and Marvel, anybody could do it all. But I think having played with the toys in their toy boxes, I'm really more interested now in creating my own toys, in doing creator-owned stuff, in pushing the boundaries of storytelling, and not just in comics, but digitally and in other media as well. So I haven't got any plans at the moment to work on any of those characters. But like I said, the thing I'm working on at the moment is doing a cover for Dan Dare that I almost swore I wouldn't have anything more to do. So the fanboy in me is quite easily tempted.
What do you think of these kind of motion comics or motion books I think you've talked about in the past? Is that something that's going to become a thing? Do you think they're going to take off? It doesn't feel like it's quite there yet, or...
No, I mean, it's interesting because they did a motion comic. We haven't quite got the terminology.
No, I didn't know what to say.
And in a way that comics is a misnomer because most comics aren't very comic, and comic book, they're not even really books. And graphic novels, some of them are novels, but some of them are just hardcover comics, But motion comics, which is what we did with Watchmen, which was basically a kind of cut up the original artwork and make it move approach. I think it was a really interesting experiment, and it appealed to people that comics wouldn't normally appeal to. But I think it didn't quite work, despite the fact that the people who made it were experts and put such a lot of effort into it. So I think that looks like cheap animation. But I am involved with a company called Madefire, who do motion books for the handheld devices, the iPads and the Android tablets, where we have movement, but we don't animate the characters. We use depth of field. We use different ways of transitioning between shots. You've got many more variables. You can introduce the balloon before the picture or the picture before the balloon. You can cut, you can crossfade, you can have atmospheric sound. But it is very much, I'm really thrilled with some of the things we've done on Madefire. One of the things that's been particularly important, I think, is we've we've given the tool to do your own motion books away. There's a huge community on the internet called DeviantArt, where people who love to draw and write and create stuff congregate, and there's a motion book section in there where they can download. Well, in fact, no, they don't download it. It's a web-based application. They can access it on the web, upload their own assets, do all the crossfades and the depth of field, the sound, everything they want, and create their own comics with that tool, which to me replicates the wonderful thing about comics when I was a kid, that unlike making movies or video, which probably didn't even exist then, all you needed was a piece of paper and a pencil. We're hopefully doing the same thing within up and coming creators, where you don't need to buy anything. You just need to we obviously have to have a computer, but you just need to log on and you can use all the expertise and be part of that community. We knew that probably the really interesting stuff would come from outside established comic book creators, and that has proved to be the thing. The first real viral hit was a thing called Milk for the Ugly, which was created by a couple of young women from Poland, completely diametrically the opposite of the superhero focus group, if you like. And they did this really strange, weird thing where they didn't have to adhere to any tricks that they learnt doing comics. So there's all sorts of interesting things happening there. But I think at the moment, digital comics are everything from, say, Comixology's, page turn slideshow stuff, to the sort of stuff that a creator called Brian Habelin has been doing, where you read a book and then with your tablet device make characters appear in 3D and interact with them in that, where there's every flavour in between. And I think it's still a bit like the Wild West to find out what the ultimate form of this is going to be. And I think I'm involved with another company called Magic Leap, who've got some really interesting technology which I probably can't or shouldn't go into here in great depth. But there are ways of using the storytelling devices that we've perfected in comics and in motion books, using that in a whole new arena of digital storytelling. So I'm very interested in that area. It's all still telling stories with words and pictures. Yeah. But to me, who is an old dog who's learnt the old tricks, it's really challenging and exciting to be involved with stuff where I feel like the new guy.
Yeah, I put a call out on Twitter actually for questions, and someone called Gavin did write and ask, are there any new artists breaking through that have inspired you or pushed you? Well, I mean, there are such wonderful artists. I mean, it's always invidious to actually give a list of people because you always miss somebody off. But there are people like Sean Murphy, who's working with Mark at the moment on Chrononauts. There are people like, I mean, of course, I'm going to blank on all these names now. I had the guy's name on the tip of my tongue, but there are so many good artists coming through now that probably I would rather not single them out. Yep. But I do feel that it's a golden age for comics. It's wonderful because all the stuff from the past is now available in collections and nice collections and well reproduced. You've got these wonderful collections of comic art shown original size that you can study, which is how I learned to draw comics. There are all these wonderful new storytelling avenues, just putting your stuff straight on the web, doing it as a motion book, doing it as some other kind of medium. It's so easy to get your work seen these days. That in the days when I was doing it, it wasn't, you had to get on the plane and fly to New York and pester somebody with it, And it's just great because the better people working in the field, the more it keeps us all on our toes. I understand also from my local comic book store that comics are doing very well at the moment. There was a fear that digital comics might knock the sales of comic book stores. I think what they're actually doing is attracting people to comics, and then they don't feel embarrassed about going into a comic book store and saying, have you got a hardcover edition of Milk for the Ugly, or whatever it might be. And we're in your study. It feels like the history of comics is kind of all around us, and you've been there, you've done that. So will you be telling your story anytime to kind of pass it on to people who are interested in the Dave Gibbons kind of career? And
Well, people do from time to time seem to be interested in it. And I know that I'm always fascinated by artists' autobiographies because you become so familiar with their work. You want to know what makes them tick. I always love to see artists' rough drawings rather than the finished work. So it's, in some ways it sounds like an arrogant thing to do, but I thought, I reckon the world's ready for my autobiography now. So I am writing it at the moment. I think I'm probably about halfway through it. I'm not doing it as a chronological thing because otherwise you get all the stuff in the front about you went to school and, your early trials and then, success at last kind of thing. So I'm going to do it as an anecdotal autobiography that's going to be alphabetical entries, because I think what people do with books, what I do with books, and a lot of my favourite books anyway, I just pick in them, I sort of think, oh, this looks interesting, read a few paragraphs. So rather than have to make somebody commit to reading my story from day one, they can dip into my autobiography, look up whatever it is that I've been involved with that they happen to be interested in. I haven't got any great grudges to settle, but I do want to tell the truth. There are certain things I've been involved in where I haven't said much at the time that I have got something to say about, and that I always knew I would say in the arena and in the method of my own choosing. So I think there's going to be things in there that will illuminate events that I've been involved in. But just as I wrote Watching the Watchmen, which was a book about how Alan and I actually did Watchmen. There are no terrible skeletons in the cupboard, and there won't be a lot about my personal life because I really think a professional autobiography is of more interest, which of course means that none of my family or close friends are talking to me because I've already told them you're probably not going to be in it. So I'm about halfway through that, and I moved into this new studio not long ago, which has been really good because I've been looking through my old boxes of junk, and there's so many things that I haven't seen print or are obscure that I'm going to illustrate it with. So even for people who think they know my work, I can guarantee there will be things in there that they haven't seen before that they might find interesting. So hopefully, it's kind of getting on a bit in this year, but hopefully next year, it'll be out there.
Awesome. Well, I know you're about to give me a little tour of the studio, which we're going to post as a separate video.
If you want.
But it sounds like I'm going to have to come back and talk to you again once the book's out.
It sounds like you are.
Get all the dirt.
Yeah. And we do want as many people as possible to buy it. So, of course, I will be...
saving some stories today.
I will be saving some.
So, Dave, thank you for being so kind with your time and letting us come and see you. Mm-hmm. Thank you guys for watching. Kingsman: The Secret Service is already out on digital HD, and it's out June 8th on DVD and Blu-ray. So, as ever, keep it tuned to IGN for all your superhero needs.